community college. She is interested in how to help students from all backgrounds overcome any obstacles they may face in studying at a community college. She is currently the Dean of Student Success here at Pierce College and serves as faculty advisor to the Gay Straight Alliance. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Krista.
We get to leave that up, right? That's awesome. I love that. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit today about my work, but I also wanted to connect it a little bit to labor because we've been talking a lot about stepping outside the binary and thinking about gender as something that goes beyond this masculine-feminine dichotomy. I'd like to talk a little bit about the legal implications of existing outside of that binary, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about, maybe more so about, what it's like to be a community college student who's outside of that gender binary, because that's really what my dissertation is about. Okay? So just very briefly, I'd like to just remind everyone that there are no federal protections for people who exist outside the gender binary. So federal law says we can't discriminate against people based on the color of their skin or sex, by the way. But there are no Title or Civil Rights Act protections for people in terms of their gender identity or sexual orientation. There are, however, some states that provide protections. Currently, there are 21 states that provide protection for men and women who have a different sexual orientation. But what do you think? How many protect for people who have a different gender expression? What do you think? All of them? Half of them? None of them? What do you think? Who's got a guess?
About a third of them, maybe?
Anybody else?
Zero.
Zero? Actually, 16 of the 21 states also have protections for gender expression and gender identity, but not all of them. In fact, I have a fun fact that I found yesterday when I was researching what I was going to talk about today. There is this thing called an Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Anybody ever heard of this one? Anybody? Yeah? Okay. Well, it turns out that this is something that we've actually been trying to pass since 1994. We can't seem to get it through our Congress. Now, in 2007, we added gender expression or identity to this act. But then in an attempt to get it through, in an attempt to get more support for this act, it was taken off. We'll have sexual orientation, but we're not quite ready to give protections to gender identity or gender expression. That was considered too taboo for people, so it was removed. As a result of an outrageous outcry, it was put back in, but it didn't make it through Congress. Anyway, sorry. Okay, we tried again in 2009, once again nothing. And right now in 2011 it was introduced again. It's still in committees, but ever since 2007, gender expression has been a part of that act. So maybe, we'll see, maybe someday we will have some federal protections, but at this point we do not. So if we have 21 states where sexual orientation is protected in employment, and we have 16 states where gender identity discrimination is prohibited in employment, that leaves how many states can you be fired for being trans? Who's good at math? Anybody? More than half. 34 states in the union you can be fired for being trans. Now think about this for a minute. I looked up one case where an individual was hired as a man, right? Because this person demonstrated that he was masculine, but then found out later, the employer found out that he was actually identified as female. This person was fired. Job was given to this person, job was taken away. All right? Now, I want to put a different context on this. Think about religion, right? Okay, so a person comes in to interview with you, and their last name is Cohen or Goldstein. What are you going to assume about that person?
That they're Jewish.
That they're Jewish, all right. Now, if that person came back to you 3 days later and said, I'm actually Catholic, could you imagine retracting your offer of employment to that person? No, never in a million years. And yet it happens to trans individuals in this country. Here's another example. A person works currently in a job, been at that job for quite some time, and then undergoes gender reassignment surgery. That person is then fired for undergoing that surgery because they now present as female. Okay, so you've got a person, and he's Jewish, and then he converts to Catholicism. Are we going to fire him?
No.
Would never in a million years consider doing something like that, yet it happens to trans individuals in this country regularly. All right, so I just wanted to put a little bit of context on that before I bring it down to community colleges, all right? Okay, so how do we change this? How do we change this weird binary way of thinking? How do we change these laws? How do we change these protections? My view is we change it through education. We change it through you. You change it, right? The future of the labor force is in this room, right? So when you guys get out there, you guys can be more educated, more empowered, better informed, and you can make those changes. So this is where my interest in community colleges come from. I've been the faculty advisor for the Gay Straight Alliance for some years now. And so I have been hearing stories from my students for years about not only the discrimination that they get from other students, but guess who else?
Teachers.
Faculty, that's right. Faculty, teachers who say things that make these students just want to crawl under a door and die. Now, this is a community college. It's supposed to be a place where we think critically, where we think progressively, where we are open to new ideas and new experiences. And yet this is happening in community colleges every day. So I decided to take a look at one community college in a large urban area in the state of California. No, it wasn't Pierce. To just take a look at what the experiences are like with these students. And here's what I found. By and large, these students found that the community college was actually a pretty accepting place. They didn't get rocks thrown at them. They didn't get yelled at. They didn't get kicked out of their houses, because that's what happened on the streets. That's what happened in their homes. That's what happened in their churches. So compared to some of the other places in their lives, they thought a community college was just a safe haven. They absolutely loved it. Oh, no, nobody messes with me because I'm gay, straight, trans, bisexual. Everybody's just here because we're people and we're all trying to learn. It's one big love fest. Okay, great. But then when you start asking the students about their experiences, I started asking them, well, tell me about a time where you felt accepted in your classroom. Tell me about a time where you did not feel accepted in a social setting, those sorts of things. And what I found was over and over and over again, the students were able to describe a thing called a microaggression. Anybody ever heard of a microaggression? Okay, so microaggressions are also known as death by 1,000 tiny cuts. Microaggressions are the behaviors that are pre-conscious, subtle, sometimes totally involuntary. We don't even know we're behaving in this way. But they alienate people of groups. They're based on our assumptions about other people based on their group identity. So, traditionally when we think of microaggressions, we think of microaggressing against an African American or black student. Black student comes into class late, instructor makes a flippant comment about how athletes don't take education seriously. Okay, first of all, how'd you know that person was an athlete? All right, this was black and an athlete. Secondly, you can't make those you can't make those generalizing comments about human beings. The instructor doesn't know that he just did anything wrong. The instructor doesn't know that he just alienated that student, but he did. The student knows it, right? So what I found was all of these LGBT students running around campus were experiencing these little tiny cuts all day long. In fact, I found them so often in my work that I started to sub-classify them. All right, this was a microaggression by a faculty member, this is a microaggression by a community member, this is a microaggression by another student. But there were still too many of them. So I started to classify them further. Well, these are ones that happen in social arenas, these are ones that happen in the classroom, and these are ones that happen in student services. And I still couldn't classify them all. They happen that often. And so ultimately I came up with 7 categories of microaggressions. And some of you may identify with a couple of these microaggressions. Maybe you've committed one of these microaggressions. Maybe you've been the victim of one of these microaggressions. Maybe you're an instructor and you go, ooh, oops. Or maybe you're a student. You go, wow, I didn't really think that that would hurt somebody's feelings. And that's what I'm here to talk about, is how do we act in ways that marginalize people from these communities, even though we don't know we're acting in those ways. And I don't have a fancy PowerPoint up. Nothing that cool. But I do have a PowerPoint, so I can send it to Professor Hicks and give it to you if you're interested in looking at it. But I do want to cover 7 basic types of microaggressions. So microaggression number 1, the humor microaggression. What do you think that's about? Sarcasm, right. What else?
Dirty jokes.
Dirty jokes, gay jokes in class. Oh man, aren't those funny? Oh dude, you're so gay. That's not funny. That's not funny. Anybody else? What do you think might be a humor microaggression? So maybe if a trans student walks into the room, people start snickering in the back. You might not notice, but that person notices. That student sure as heck notices. You better believe it. And that student no longer feels comfortable in that classroom. Okay, here's another. A nonverbal microaggression. This would happen to a lot of my trans participants, especially around restrooms. So these are the stares, the glances, the facial expressions. Here are 3 facial expressions that students said that they got from other students. Shock, spite, and fear. So a trans student walks into a bathroom, somebody looks at them and goes, you may not have meant that. Maybe that was just an automatic reaction on your part. But that student notices. And that student feels marginalized because of that reaction. Or here's the other one. This is actually my favorite. And this really demonstrated to me how subtle a microaggression can be. So one student walks into a woman's bathroom. This happens a lot to this student. Walks into a woman's bathroom. The person in the bathroom looks up to make sure they're in the right one. If this happens once, that's cool. All right, that could happen to anyone. But for this student, it happened again and again and again and again. And this student is afraid to go to the bathroom at the community college because they just don't want that glance anymore. They get yelled at, all that kind of stuff, but the glances was really what killed this particular student. Stereotype microaggression. So this one is where people will use the non-preferred pronoun again and again and again and again. I had a student whose instructor just refused to refer to her as female because she presented sort of male. The instructor decided that she looked masculine. And so she just kept referring to her as female. And the student would correct the instructor. Actually, I'm a female. 5 minutes later, the instructor would refer to her as male. Again and again and again. Again, once, no big deal. 1,000 times, death by 1,000 tiny cuts. Verbal microaggressions. These are the ones we think of most often. What words do we hear? Go ahead, shout them out.
Tranny.
Tranny. What else?
He, she.
He, she. Or what is it? She-male.
It.
It. That's
Freak.
a common one.
Dyke.
Dyke. Any others? Come on, you know them.
Gaylord.
Gaylord. All right, what else? Now we're warming up. All right, now, when we're talking about a microaggression, this is different from discrimination in one important way. And that is, when we're talking about discrimination, we're talking about a comment that's targeting a specific individual to make that individual feel uncomfortable. When we're talking about microaggressions, we're not talking about something that's targeted to a specific individual. Maybe it's just we like to say the word fag, or we think it's funny to say something's gay, or we don't know how to refer to transgender individuals, so we use the term it. There's an instructor, by the way, who used the term it to refer to a transgender athlete in class. All right, assumption microaggression. This is my personal favorite. Okay, so the assumption microaggression is the one where hetero students assume that the student who's outside the gender binary is attracted to them just because they're attracted to people of that sex. This is amazing to me. Oh no, I don't want to be around her. She's just going to try to hit on me. Where does this assumption come from that just because you're trans, you want to sleep with everybody?
Well, this is just, I think it's sort of like an ego thing type of thing, because, I mean, what happens to a lot of guys, like, they'd be, I mean, if they're talking to a gay person, it's really often they'd be like, so, like, are you, like, attracted to me because you're gay? I mean, I think it's a whole ego thing, because maybe, this is just from my perspective, maybe deep down they kind of want him to be attracted to him, but at the same time, it's sort of like making sure to make sure that the person who asks that is, well, not gay himself. It's pretty much the whole masculine ego type thing.
Yeah, actually, a lot of these, and I do agree that I think that it is definitely a masculine ego thing in the sense that Professor Hicks was talking about, because it does challenge that male supremacy, right? Because it challenges that male myth. But it was interesting to me that most of the examples that I heard about this assumption microaggression was actually from women. Women not wanting to touch, not wanting to be around, not wanting to talk to other women who were lesbian or people who were transgender. So it happens in both realms. It happens in both. All right, two more. The avoidance microaggression, that's when if you find out somebody's trans, you don't want to be around them anymore. Or if you see that somebody's trans, you don't want to talk to them or you don't want to touch them. That happens a lot. And you may not think they notice, but they do. They notice. And they don't feel comfortable. They don't want to be in class after people don't want to touch them, all right? And finally is the dismissive microaggression. This one happens a lot in class. I found that a lot of these students wanted to talk about their gender expression in class. They wanted to talk about their sexual orientations in class. This was something that was meaningful to them. It was something that made education come alive. And yet, instructors are not comfortable talking about it in their classes. And so when an empowered student speaks up and says, well, here's my experience as a transgender person, or here's my experience as a lesbian, the instructor will say, oh, we're not really talking about that right now. Right? Why aren't we talking about that right now? Is there anybody in this room, who's not touched, who's not affected, who doesn't have an opinion about what's going on around gay rights, around gay marriage, around teaching LGBTQ topics in schools? Anybody in this room not connected to that? Oh, it's very, very relevant to education today. It's very relevant in political science classes, and history classes, and English classes, and philosophy classes, and yet those students who were trying to make those vital connections found themselves cut off by a lot of instructors who didn't know how to facilitate that conversation themselves. So how does this affect student engagement? Because that was the second piece, right? Okay, so I found that there were 3 ways in which students respond to stigma, these microaggressions. Way number 1 is that they disengage. Either they drop the class, or they don't reveal their sexual orientation or gender identity, or they just avoid anything on campus other than their class, right? I got one great quote from a student who said, who really wanted to go to counseling. And he said, I want to go to counseling to see if I might be transgender or not, but I'm scared of getting looked at, like, what are you doing here? You were born this way and that's how you stay, or how do you expect for this to happen? Because I've never met a counselor, and I don't know if she'd be willing to help me out. Now, this is a student who's never even had a bad experience with a counselor, but because that student lives with these microaggressions every day, they're afraid to go out on that limb, because they're afraid that they're going to be stigmatized by that counselor. We have other students who go the opposite direction, right? They engage more. And sometimes it's in a very, very positive way. I heard one story about a student who was sitting in a class when an instructor used the term hermaphrodite to refer to an intersex person. Now, the student knows full well about the language that's used around the trans community, knows that that is not an appropriate term to use. It's medical terminology, it's just bad sense, right? Of course, the student is the expert here, not the instructor, not the other students in the class. That one student is the expert. Now, this student was smart. This student went up to the instructor after class and said, you know what? It's really not an appropriate term to use. We prefer intersex and just fine. Right? Now, this was a good story because the instructor actually went home, Googled it, learned all about the history of that term, came back the next day, apologized to the entire class for using that inappropriate term, talked about the history of this term, and gave students resources on how they can find one.
Wow.
Cool. Awesome. We love that. This is what happens. We get an empowered student and a nurturing instructor together. We see magic, right? But we don't know if it's going to go that way. Right? So the third way is some students just didn't seem to care. right? So they heard these gay jokes in class, they heard their instructors say things that were marginalizing towards them, and they just kind of said, I'm here for an education. They separated themselves emotionally from class. These are also the students who chose not to engage in that class discussion around gender identity or sexual orientation. These are the students who are just here to get that piece of paper and get out. And you know what, that's fine, that's fine. But I think we're missing out on a key opportunity to engage students really powerfully and really meaningfully, and not just that trans student, right? But everybody in the room who's got a stake in this conversation. Now, there was one silver lining, and that was I found that when students can come together and create counter spaces, not counter spaces that put your cut things on, not that kind, but a safe space for themselves, we found that those students were more engaged in class, did better in their studies, they stayed in school more often, and this is very consistent with the language about with the language about counter spaces for students of color as well. These tend to be spaces that really help students thrive in education. Another thing that really helped these students was just those teachers who were allies, and they didn't have to